Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Sally Talk Live. It is Saturday. I'm sorry. It is Friday morning. I know it's Friday morning. Well, this is what happens when you do a live podcast. You say Saturday instead of Friday. Anyway, it's such a beautiful, beautiful morning. And I got up this morning and I had some classical music on to get me in the mood for today's episode. And then I went outside and I clipped all the roses are blooming. So my roses in my backyard are blooming. You know, it's nice that I've been lucky enough to live in two houses that have had the previous owner be an elderly woman who had lived there. You know, she had raised all her children. And in the old house, I had beautiful roses in the backyard. And then also in this house, we have these beautiful roses and they're old. So the old roses have the scent. Some of the new roses, they've bred out the odor to get the colors. But these are beautiful roses, and they have the beautiful colors, and they also have a wonderful scent. So every time I clip a couple of the roses to bring inside the house, I always thank the Mrs. Abbott who was in my house before me. I'm very grateful for all the people that live before me in houses and plant all sorts of beautiful plants. It's another one of my favorite things to do. I like to garden, but I never seem to have as much time as I'd like to do it. So maybe as I get older and have less to do. So today's episode, I wanted to talk about music and the meaning of music. To me, mainly, music is really, really important to me. So to fit this into a podcast episode is going to be tricky because it's so fundamentally part of my life and who I am that it's a difficult thing to then sit down and go, wow, how do I talk about what music means to me and how meaningful it is to me? But also how I went to it and turned to it to work through my grief through John's death and then also my father's death last year in 2018. So it really has helped me. It really has helped me work through it. And so I decided to do kind of like a little bit of a walkthrough and a 5 steps or 5 categories. So then it would help me categorize it, and then I wouldn't. Then I would be able to kind of like be able to share it with you instead of having it be so part of me. So I'm going to use the acronym of music, and then I'm going to use each letter. And so I thought I'd do it that way instead of numbering them. And I'll start off by explaining, I did a podcast earlier that was about my Irish heritage, and that was on my mother's side. But my father's side were all musicians. And I'm not sure, because I haven't gone all the way back to Germany, which is one of my goals, is that I'd like to go back. But my great-great, I know you're not counting, I'm just thinking great-great-grandfather came from Germany in 1856. And the famous story is that he landed in... He ended up in Springfield, Illinois, and I don't know why. So that's one of my things I want to look into. But he ended up in Springfield, Illinois, and the famous family story is that he shook Abraham Lincoln's hand when he was running, he was living there, and he shook his hand, and so that was a famous story. So that would work out time-wise. But his son was my great-grandfather, and he was a very famous musician in St. Louis. Somehow they ended up in St. Louis. They had a big family, and he was a very famous musician in St. Louis. He was the lead harpist for the St. Louis Symphony. He was also head of the Musicians Union, or very instrumental in the I'm going to use that word a lot, of the Musicians Union. And he knew John Philip Sousa. He knew W.C. Handy. And the family lived in Memphis, and then he had a bunch of kids, but the main ones were Frank, Adolf, Harry, and George. And I always think about this because I myself have 4 sons. So it's just interesting to me that these that's in my family of these four brothers. They were all musicians, and they did a lot with their father and played a lot. And they played a lot of instruments. I mean, it was my great-grandfather also played not only harp, he also played violin, and he played many different other piano, of course. And so Adolf was a famous organist, like a really famous organist, church organist, and he had or classically trained. He had a very, very expensive organ that he did a fundraiser for in Memphis, Tennessee, at Calvary Episcopal Church, and it cost, I forget, an exorbitant amount of money in 1935, but he did a fundraiser during the middle of the Depression, and he raised money and got this famous, big, huge organ. And he used to put on Handel's Messiah, the whole thing, with everybody, with an orchestra, with, everything. And he used to put on all sorts of very unusual Brahms, which I've just recently started researching and listening to some of the things that he would, some beautiful choral pieces that Brahms wrote. I mean, it was a serious business. And before my great-grandfather passed away in 1933, he was always playing the harp there and with Adolf, and they traveled all over the place. And Adolf went overseas and played in New York, and they were big musicians. And so when my father came along, here they had all these kids and the four brothers, and out of the four brothers, they only had three kids amongst the four of them, and the other two were daughters, and then my father. So the three cousins they were all only children, but they were cousins, so they were kind of like siblings. And none of them wanted to be musicians. So that was quite the opposite of what you hear in those stories about, musicians coming from families that discourage them from being musicians. Well, in my family, in my father's family, here were all these people that were paid musicians, did very well during the Depression, and a whole range of instruments that they all played. And they turned around and their kids nobody wanted to do it. So my father grew up in the house with my uncle Adolf, who was the only one who didn't have a child. And he was really hard on my dad and made him practice and taught him piano. And so my father was really a beautiful pianist. I mean, he really just, and the main thing was his touch. I appreciate that now so much when I hear somebody play the piano who has a beautiful touch, because it makes a big difference in bringing the emotion out of the piano. And so anyway, my dad had a beautiful touch, and he used to play the piano all the time, and he was a really good sight reader. He was not good at improvisation. And so when I came along, I started playing piano when I was young, but I stopped, and I'm no good. I can play like three things on the piano. Like at a dinner party, you might think I'm a good pianist, and then you find out that I only know three things. But I started playing saxophone when I was in fourth grade. That was the high school jazz ensemble came down and played when I lived in New Jersey, and the guy who was the band director looked like Al Pacino in the 70s with like tinted glasses, and he was like the coolest thing walking, Mr. Starner. And he turned around and he said, hey, kids. I was in elementary school, and he turned around in front of the band and he goes, hey, kids, we're going to play a couple tunes for you. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they did da 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 da, and it was the Tonight Show theme. It was awesome. Blew my hair back. And this one kid stood up with the tenor saxophone, and he went blah, 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 and he played all over, and I went, okay, that's that. I want to play that. How do I play that? So that summer I went to a workshop. My dad rented me a saxophone, and the next thing you know, I was playing saxophone. And so I started in elementary school. By the time I was in middle school, I was pretty good. In fact, that cool Mr. Starner guy showed up at a camp I was in and said, hey, do you have lessons? Are you taking lessons? And at that time I hadn't been. And I think I was in 7th grade. And he said, well, if you want to come down to the high school, I'll give you lessons. And he used to give me an hour and a half lesson for $5. once a week, and I would carry my tenor saxophone because my mom was working. I would carry my saxophone all the way from the middle school to high school. It was heavy, but I brought it, and I went, and I didn't practice as much as I should have, but boy, I love Mr. Starner's. And Mr. Starner thought I should try out for the New Jersey State Jazz Ensemble when that came around, and I rehearsed that with him and worked with that. He helped me on improvisation, and he was really he just really was an amazing teacher. And I did really well, and I made it. I was first chair at the New Jersey State Jazz Ensemble. And I was really way out of my league in a way, because these guys, when these people showed up, they were all, they practiced 5-6 hours a day, and they were real musicians. And I have always felt that I rode a long way on my, what I inherited, but I definitely knew that music was not going to be a profession for me, because I just didn't have that desire to come home and practice and perfect everything. And that's really what you need, to move forward. But I really, really enjoyed it. And so that leads me into the story with John. When John and I started going out, we found out that we had a lot in common when it came to music. And we both loved music a lot. And John was a lot more outspoken about it. I was kind of quiet about my love of music. I mean, I would always be listening to music. I'd always be following things. I definitely love classical music as well as big band and jazz. I do love modern music, but I'm very selective with that. And even when I was in high school, I liked Billy Joel because I liked the musicality. Usually anything that I liked, it had pretty melodies, and there was a musical quality to it along with the lyrics. But I wasn't as big a lyric person as much as I was a music person. And so when John and I started dating, we found out how much we loved music. And I really like a lot of different kinds of music too, so I'll listen to pretty much anything. He loved guitar, and he had guitarists that he followed. And I had to say that going into our relationship, I wasn't as big a fan of guitar as he was. He definitely taught me to be more appreciative of guitar music. And so I got a lot better. And so still, Oz Noy is still one of my favorite guitarists, and he's a very obscure guitarist, but we used to go listen to him, and he's amazing. So I changed over my appreciation. But what was funny was that when John heard that I had played saxophone, he wanted me to play for him, and he kept saying, "You got to play for me, you got to play for me." And then I had to give him the sad story finally about how I sold the saxophone that my dad had bought me. My dad had bought me a really beautiful saxophone at one point by the time I was in high school. And that was one of my treasured things. And I sold it at one point before, the divorce, when we didn't have any money to pay for the rent. It really was a true story. And I felt like it was sitting up on the shelf and I wasn't using it, and my kids were more important. And, I don't know, and I should do another podcast about that, when you don't have any money and you need to pull together the money for the rent, all sentimentality kind of goes out the wayside, and you just do what you need to do. And so when I told him that story, he hated it. He hated that story so much. So I had pretty much forgotten about it. And my birthday came around, and we were going out to dinner for my birthday, and I was over at his apartment, and he says, "Okay, you have to close your eyes," because I wasn't able to wrap your present. And I was like, I can't imagine what in the world he could be giving me. And I closed my eyes, and I said, okay. And so I opened my eyes, and in front of me was this saxophone, a tenor saxophone. It was the craziest thing ever. It was a crazy thing. I just sat there and I stared at it. I never had any, I can't say I never had, because I had a roommate who was incredibly thoughtful with her presents, but people have been very thoughtful with presents, but this really was a thoughtful present, because I didn't even know I wanted it. I didn't even know I wanted a saxophone again. I had so buried my desire to play the saxophone when I made the decision to sell my saxophone. So I sat there and I just was overwhelmed, overcame with emotion, and just started weeping over this saxophone. And he was like, did I do something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Like, and I all I could do was shake my head like, no, 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 no. This is a beautiful present. This is a beautiful present. Just give me a minute. And then, of course, only John could do this. He'd just take it out and play something, and it was just awful. I said, I haven't played in so many years. My embouchure is a mess. Like, no way. And he goes, no, you got to play for me. Come on, I understand. So I like to say that it sounded a little like Bill Clinton on the Tonight Show. I played Summertime just like Bill Clinton. That seems to be the tenor saxophone song you play when somebody pushes you. So anyway, music was really an amazing thing. And so to honor him and honor the whole idea of it, I said, I'm a big believer in signs. I like to do things because I think things are a sign to me and I'm supposed to do something with it. So I nosed around to see if there was community bands. I was in a community band in my hometown and played with a lot of professionals when I was young. So I was like, or quasi professionals. And so I found the Burbank Community Band and here in Burbank, and I played with them. This was the first year. This last season, I didn't play with them because I was at Boys and Girls Club, but I played with them for about 5 years, and John even taught himself alto saxophone after he got me the saxophone, and then he ended up playing in the Burbank Community Band, and we did that together. So music has a lot of meaning for me, and obviously a lot of meaning with John. And so when I was putting this together in my head, I was thinking about, first of all, for the first letter of music is M for meaningful. So I feel like my whole life I was just raised, and music's just been a backdrop, almost like like when you see a movie and there's the score of the film. I mean, I feel like there's a score for my life with music. There's no question. There's some pieces of music that I can't even tell you how many times I've listened to because they're important to me. So what happened was that after John died, I read there was one book that I read that was really powerful and really walked me through a lot. And I am going to do a podcast on it. I'm just not ready yet. It's kind of very personal to me, and I really want to do it justice. So I'm not going to divulge what it was, but it was a very, very powerful book. And in the book, he talked a lot about artists and how artists reflect how artists are so important is because they reflect back what a society has learned or what a society is feeling, and it reflects it back to us so that we can all share it. And so music obviously is that. And so after John died, I realized that I needed to put together something of music that reminded me of him, and also that was just meaningful to me, that would really help me keep me on track. And the kids had introduced me to Spotify, which is an amazing, beautiful thing. I mean, Spotify is so great. It's just amazing to me that you can just kind of go, oh, there's that song when I was a kid. And that's exactly what I did. I put together many different playlists of different songs, and I really pulled out like a lot of stuff that I remembered that I hadn't had or I didn't have recordings of. And I put together one playlist called Music of Meaning. And that is a very eclectic group of music that means a lot to me. Each piece brings in a certain memory or a certain just powerful emotion. And I don't listen to it all the time. I don't listen to that playlist all the time because I don't want to overdo it. But when I go for my long walks, or I have some time to myself, or I just need some inspiration, I will just put on that playlist and I'll hit shuffle and I'll just see what comes up, because every piece of music I've put in there has something that's really, really meaningful to me and really powerful. Sometimes I'm walking and I'm crying because it's something that's really struck me and means a lot to me. And so I just highly recommend that because just really just no holds barred. The things that evoke some sort of very powerful memory, it really can get you back on track and reminding of who you are so that you can move forward, because you need that. The U is for uplifting. So I find there's several pieces of music that are incredibly uplifting to me and that really make me like just feel better after something's over. And one of those pieces of music is the hymnal for called "How Great Thou Art." When I was at church one day, a gentleman in the choir wanted to sing. He was going to sing it, and he talked about how great thou art is his favorite hymn, because when he would go hiking he was a big hiker and he would go hiking in the Sierras and everything. He really felt like the words to "How Great Thou Art" were very powerful to him, and so that hymn really helped me when I was really low and sad, because you can get to this place when you're grieving about how you're why me, and why did this happen to me, and why did this happen to me? And then when you listen to a piece of music, it's not that you're made to feel insignificant, but you're made to feel like you're part of something bigger. And when I hear the hymn, "How Great Thou Art," I feel like I'm part of something bigger, and that I will figure out why my part had to have this big pain in it, had to have this excruciating pain in it, because we all seem to have at some point some sort of pain, suffering, and it was what binds us all together. So when I hear the words to that hymn, and I'll put it on my Facebook page so that I don't have to read it through, but it talks about and John and I used to hike a lot, so it reminds me a lot of our hikes and everything. When through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook, and feel the gentle breeze. So that reminds me a lot of our, when we were hiking, and just a lot of time we spent together. And I love nature, and nature is really important, I think, to bring you back on track. And then the third verse, which is on some recordings, they don't have it, which I think is kind of interesting. And when I think that God, his son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. That's another one where it just reminds me of how many other people have suffered, how many other people have to bear a grief, and it made me feel like I was part of something bigger, and so that hymn really helped me. It's very, very uplifting to me. When I get to the end of that, I always feel a lot better. Serenity for S. I could not sleep. It was hard for me to sleep, and it still sometimes can be hard for me to sleep. And the one thing that got me through sleeping was setting up Clair de Lune on my, and then just having it play out. I would have it play out, and then I'd finally fall asleep. And Clair de Lune always calmed me down. And it's kind of interesting because Clair de Lune actually translates to light of the moon, and it's Claude. And I hear two different pronunciations, Debussy and then sometimes Debussy. So I like to say Debussy because it just sounds more exotic. But he wrote that when he was 20. It's part of a suite, and I actually went in and actually found that suite, because I'm going to talk about that in a minute, about actually listening to the whole piece of music instead of just the little part of it. But I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But he wrote it when he was 28, and it's called the Suite Bergamasque. I think that's how you say Bergamasque. I don't speak French. But he wrote it when he was 28, and he actually didn't want to publish it because he thought it was immature. he he thought that his music, after that, he wrote things that were far more mature. So, but anyway, Clair de Lune is a beautiful piece of music, and that really helped me sleep. It really did. It just helped me sleep and made me feel very calm and peaceful and serene where I could. I was just talking to my sister yesterday who just lost her husband. I said, I go to sleep and I say, God, you take the worrying for now. I'm going to go to sleep. You worry about it, and then I'll pick it up when I wake up. I'll pick up the worrying. The eye in music is inspiring. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about Beethoven. So what's interesting is that I love classical music, but I'll be honest with you, I'm a little lazy. And I love Mozart. Mozart was really one of the first composers, and he's very famous, obviously. But I just love Mozart, everything about Mozart. I think it was the movie Amadeus that really opened my eyes to really research his life and read a lot about him. And I read a lot about him. He's just a fascinating character, and his music is crazy. And he was so prolific. He wrote so much music in his short life. It's mind-boggling how much music he wrote and how amazing it was. So I listened to other composers, but I never really paid that much attention to really learning about them or being able to identify things and all that other stuff. And so Beethoven obviously is a famous composer. I never really read about him. I didn't know that much about him. And when I was reading this book that I was telling you about, the author was talking about Ode to Joy. And Ode to Joy is an interesting, is part of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it was the first choral where they actually put where a major composer put a big choir in one of his symphonies. So that was kind of an unusual thing. And when he premiered it, it was a huge production and all of that. But what's interesting about that story is that when they put it on, he conducted it, but he was not the conductor. They had another conductor because Beethoven was deaf. He was almost completely deaf by this point. He had started losing his hearing when he was younger, but by this time he was pretty much deaf. So everyone just watched the baton of the other conductor, and they just let him stand there and wave his arms around. And the legend is that when it was all over, he didn't know it was over, and he was still conducting once it was over. Not for long, but for a little bit, to the point where it showed that he really couldn't hear anything. And they had to kind of stop him and turn him around because the audience was going crazy. Because can you imagine the first time you'd ever heard Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Ode to Joy, like these people, it was the first time it had ever been premiered. And all the people were going crazy and clapping, but they started waving their handkerchiefs and raising their hats and doing all these things to show him how much they loved it, because everybody knew he was deaf, which is really remarkable. So I was reading about that and I thought, well, that's really amazing. And in this book, he talked about how you really need to listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony from the beginning, because the Ode to Joy is kind of like it's the sweet part, it's the happy part. It's the part that everybody, the part that everyone hears and always goes to, and they played it, in Die Hard, and I think they played Die Hard. But anyway, I mean, we always go to that, da 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 da, like I played at the beginning. But there's a whole symphony that it goes with, and the symphony is basically a testament to struggle and to the journey through life. And it was based on a poem about life and the difficult struggles of life, and the goal for us all to live in brotherly love. And so it's a big, long struggle. And then at the end, we get that beautiful choral piece. And so it's very inspiring for music. And it makes you, that's the end result. And so we always as a society love to go right to the sweet spot, right? It's like orange juice, it's a hassle to eat an orange, but the fiber is good for you, but you're not going to eat an orange. So we drink juice, thinking we're getting all the same benefit, but we're not, because we're not eating the orange. So it's the same thing with the Beethoven's Ninth. That's like this beautiful long symphony, and it's a whole testament to the struggle of life, and then you get the sweet thing at the end. So I went, when did he write this? So he wrote it late in his life. Obviously, he was deaf. And I came upon a letter that he had written that they found in his papers. And, when I was reading about this is what I do. I go into the history of people and stuff, and I read all this stuff. So anyway, it's called here we go, Heiligenstadt. I think that's it, Heiligenstadt Testament, which was basically kind of like a last will and testament that he had written, but it was just in his papers so that when he passed away, his brothers would find it. And in that, he claimed that once his hearing started to go, he had planned to commit suicide. And because he felt like God had given this great talent and this great musical ability, so he was losing his hearing. So what good was he? And how ironic was that? And he needed, so his life was meaningless. And that he had gotten to a point where he felt like it wasn't worth it. So he said, he wrote in it, he said, "Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, and misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me? How do you not know the secret causes of my seeming? From childhood, my heart and mind were disposed to the gentle feelings of goodwill. I was even ever eager to accomplish great deeds. But reflect now that for 6 years I have been a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, cheated year after year, in the hope of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure would take years or perhaps be impossible." So he started realizing that he was no longer going to be able to, hear. And he said, "I'm compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. When I at times tried to forget all this, how harshly I was repulsed by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. And yet it was impossible for me to say to men, 'Speak loud' or 'shout,' because I was deaf." So in this whole thing that he wrote, he talks about how he had gotten to the point where he should just end it all. And what stopped him was that he decided that since God had given him this gift of music, that he would continue on and write until God decided that he shouldn't live anymore. And so he decided to just fulfill whatever it was that he was supposed to do. So he would just continue to write music and continue to compose and just continue to do it until God decided. And what's interesting is that if he had committed suicide, he would have never written the Ninth Symphony. And it's interesting how powerful the Ninth Symphony is. When you look up the Ninth Symphony, it says that it is considered the most important, it says, regarded by many critics and musicologists as one of Beethoven's greatest works and one of supreme achievements in the history of Western music. In 2010, as of 2010, it stood as one of the most performed symphonies in the world. And so it's things like that that makes me remember that that's why it's not really our life to take, I think. And it breaks my heart, that John felt like it was his life to take, because it wasn't. Because, what amazing things he may have been able to do if he hadn't done it. But I think it just goes to show that with mental illness, sometimes they can't get to that point where they can make that reasonable decision that Beethoven made, that he was just decided he was just going to stay and let God decide when to take him. And then to think that he was completely deaf writing Beethoven, the Ninth Symphony, and all the people welcomed it with open arms. So So for C is cathartic. So I found that if I put together the music of meaning, I also, when my father passed away, I put together an entire playlist on Spotify of my father's music. And I listened to, so that reminds me of my father. And I was able to find all sorts of things that my father used to play on Spotify. It was so great. So now if I'm in a melancholy and I want to think about my dad, I can hit playlist, hit dad, hit shuffle, go for a walk, and think about my dad. So music has been a huge part, and for, to help me bring an emotion out, cry it out, and then feel better afterwards. It's been extremely cathartic, and I highly recommend of taking any kind of music and any pieces of music that stir you and touch you and putting them in a kind of a sacred place so that you can visit it when you need it. So when you're feeling low and you're feeling overwhelmed, just remember how remarkable it is that we have that. That's what I think really separates humans. It's really something I definitely believe that music is a gift from God, because it's definitely something that binds us together. It brings us together, and it speaks to us on a different level than anything else. And it's important to treat it with reverence, I think, and especially the pieces of music that really hit you and really, really speak to you. I think you need to treat them like a treasure that you do any object or any feeling or person in your life. I think any piece of music that has spoken to you needs to be in a place that you can access it and give it the reverence it deserves and visit it when you need it. So that is my episode today. I went a little long, but you know what? It was an important topic to me. So if you stuck with me this long, I really appreciate it. I'm going to give a shout out to my sponsor. I am an independent consultant with Arbonne International. And so Arbonne is, because kind of technically my sponsor, since I haven't monetized this podcast yet. But for 39 years, Arbonne International has watched out for you and watched out for the ingredients that are healthy and good for you and that you should put on your skin, and not use the ones that are unhealthy, cheap, and are, used to keep the product stable in the warehouse. It's kind of like the jelly that you see now where it says, oh, it's all natural ingredients now, because now we know you're onto us. And so we've taken out all the bad stuff. Well, Arbonne never put the bad stuff in to begin with. And so that's the company you need to be with. If you have any questions about Arbonne International, I'd be happy to answer them. My website is sallyholida@arbonne.com. sallyholida.arbonne.com. And you can go on my Facebook page and send me a direct message if you want to know more about it. Please follow me on my podcast. It's going to help me because I'm going to start doing a big push. I'm almost done with my website, and I'm going to do a big push and start really sharing it and advertising it and everything else. So if you follow me, that helps me get on other platforms. And it's called Sally Talk. It's on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. And you can come and visit me, and then I put extra material on my Facebook page especially. So thanks so much for listening. And I will have my guest, Marianne Bean, is going to be my guest next week. She is a real estate agent here in this area in Southern California, extraordinaire. But she made that career decision later in her life. And so we're going to talk a little bit about her previous career and why did she make a big shift. And again, going with my series of kind of women around the 50 mark that had decided that they're going to move forward and change it up and have a lot to look for. So anyway, that's it. And I'm out of here. So I'll talk to you next week. And thanks so much for tuning in.